Whoa.
Watch out.
No one to warn you about sitting next to
Yeah.
you with that hammer.
Great. So I just want to make a couple of comments on this tracking results for investment presentation that Rudy's going to make. But I just want to say I was over in Pendleton with Mr. Mulvihill there, and we had an incredible meeting of the around the Eastern Promise. And it felt like kind of like one of our regional solutions teams almost. I mean, the energy that was in the room and the incredible partnerships, both public and private, focused on actually not just on increasing the college-going culture and increasing the number of degrees that kids attain in high school, but also connecting very young children who might not be otherwise hooked into an early learning program with an early learning program through the public libraries. And it was just very elegant, and I think speaks to the tremendous possibilities involved with extending the Achievement Compact concept outside the direct education community to a whole host of other partners in the community that I think are anxious to play a role and make a commitment to support this agenda. So it's a good show, thanks. Yeah. So I think one of the reasons that we are trying to have this retreat, if you will, is to try to gain a better sense of clarity about what roles and responsibilities of the OEIB. And I know that there have been some birthing pains since we passed this legislation, and I think we probably have some yet to come. But I think it's important to just take a minute and step back and appreciate really what we've accomplished in the last 18 months, which is really quite remarkable. We've hired our chief education officer to help guide this effort. We have introduced the concept of achievement compacts and a budget that's focused on strategic investments. And we've adopted a strategic plan, and I don't know if you got the vision adopted this morning, but both of which will be, I think, very, very important to guide our work going forward. I also recognize that the OEIB has had a tendency to mean different things, represent different hopes, and I imagine different fears for different people. And I think it's very important that the authorities that we have right now and the relationships we have with other boards and other agencies remain a work in progress, that we evolve and adapt as we go forward. But there were two specific issues that we were trying to respond to when we created the OEIB. The first one was that we need to have a single system of public education. And for some kids, that starts at birth and goes through up into their working lives, and that system had to be much better aligned and much better integrated. And the second one was that the state needs to be much more strategic in the way it invests in education if we're really going to meet these aspirational outcomes that we've established for ourselves. So I think that, debating a big number, while important, is simply not enough. If we want better outcomes for students, we have to have a much better sense about how those investments are actually connected to students and to strategy. So as Nancy says, we need to be budgeting a plan rather than just planning a budget. So to me at least, the OEIB is a P220 board, and it's an investment board, and it's focused really on sort of large strategic outcomes and overarching strategies, as opposed to other boards which are much more focused on sort of the details of budget and rule making for the operation of the school system. And I think by adopting the strategic plan, we've gone a long way towards identifying both our key objectives and our core strategies that we want to recommend to others, in this case probably the legislature, and that we want to implement ourselves over the next 3 to 7 years. So it seems to me that the key question before us now is basically how do we monitor our efforts as a board, and how do we actually adapt our efforts based on what we learn from that monitoring. We've spent a lot of time thinking about the roles and responsibilities of our local education partners. I hope that we're willing to spend as much time looking at ourselves and asking some key questions like, what is it we want to achieve? How will we know when we've achieved it? And how do we monitor our success or lack of our success? How is that going to be measured? And I'm hoping that we can come out with a clear sense of that, and I think the presentation that Rudy is going to make on tracking for investment results will be a good start. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Governor.
So this morning, we had an opportunity to at least start this conversation with an eye toward using some of the, or not some of, but using this particular sheet as the frame of reference for how OEIB would, in fact, track results over time. And that conversation, I thought, was a pretty helpful one in that not only did it shape or reshape some of the things that will be on this sheet, but also, it did help us to sort of begin to talk about some of the data points that we both have and versus what we don't have but need. One of the places to kind of take the introduction you just gave is to start identifying a couple of things. One, there have to be, or at least there likely will be, some softer data measures of our work, particularly in light of the fact that some of the hard data measures that are embedded in this metric are probably not going to be baked by that time. So if we were to be sitting in front of an editorial board, and if we had to define, hey, listen, you guys have been in existence for the better part of now a year, so now what's different? What's better? What changed? What are the things that we actually, on the soft data or hard data side, would actually be willing to advance as evidence that there's a different educational dialogue or a different educational outcome on the horizon? And one of the things, and again, the board can chime in with this, but one of the things that has been intriguing to me is this question of what the nature of how has leadership changed at every level in this state, whether it's in K-12 or in terms of the early learning centers, in parents and communities. I mean, are we affecting who it is and how it is that people actually begin to pick up the gauntlet and lead? One measure that for me is, again, this is a soft data measure, but it's something I would submit to the board, is whether or not there are conversations in communities that are where the conversation is eliciting or bringing forward more and perhaps new faces in the realm of leadership. Are we seeing more people stepping up to the plate and beginning to actually own some of this? It seems to me that our dialogue, our ability to be successful, is a function of how many conversations our communities having themselves, led by themselves, owned by themselves, even chiseled out of their own logic and pain. But it is essentially how many and where are those places that's happening. When you describe the work that Mark has done over in Eastern Oregon, when I had an opportunity to see it last year, when you've seen some of the people who've come forward and already started with some of the regional achievement compacts and so forth, what I view that as is this is the sponsorship of people feeling now empowered to tackle this thing on their own, and that they are bringing that resource as a new kind of intelligence to the game. And I think we ought to start taking stock of things like that. Again, it's not a hard data. It's not on my metric sheet. It's not something that, but we should be thinking about this in very, very different terms than just what did the needle do in terms of third grade reading. We know we're going to have to monitor that. We know that that's going to happen. But are there some other specific, seemingly intangible, but very vital, necessary parts to this transformational piece? How would we know that we have moved away from control and more toward commitment? Like, what would the evidence be of that we would accept as being evidence that we are now doing a really much better job? People are coming forward. They're leaning into these conversations. They're bringing their own data to us. They're knocking on doors and asking for help. I mean, that kind of thing. And I just like to hear a conversation with the board about, well, what other kind of ways should we be assessing our own, monitoring our own results over the course of, not necessarily just this year, frankly, it could be any year, but just, are there some other metrics beyond this? We had the conversation this morning on this. But ideally, there would be other points of light as well.
You want to go around?
Yeah, Yvonne?
Yes.
However you'd like to do that. Yvonne, you-
Well, I just had one that occurred to me. As I listened this morning to our conversation, I think one that we've already taken ground on are the legislative changes. So what are those things around policies and legislative changes that, at least in the long term, we do see are going to enable us to have this P20 system? I think a lot of the work of a board, and especially one like this, whose role is at the policy level, is, I think, a challenge is to identify what are those things that we really think are going to make the big differences going forward. And when I just think about, the fact that we have Rob Saxton and Dr. Crew and the board and have moved forward on key funding strategies and those are some big things. I know mandate relief is one we've talked about. I think that at least from the field, the perception is that we still have new mandates coming. Even though there might not be mandates from the legislature, there are mandates in other ways, like moving to Common Core and those kinds of things that we know are things we have to do. But I think that wherever we can not only track by policy, but also if there's places we could name that we have taken off the plate, would be measures of success, I think. And then also the places where we may be identifying barriers that we couldn't identify until we peeled back a few layers. So even if we haven't taken ground on them, if we could identify that we now know these are new ones that we need to work on.
I think the latter point's really very significant, because one of the things we're discovering with our CCOs is that we're running into problems we never even imagined before because they're really operational, and it's a very good point.
People like to be around the learn and things that you don't even realize. If you were to plan ahead on a metric, plan ahead on a partner being involved, you don't even realize that you didn't include these people who want to join later on to be a part of a winning organization. And what I'm getting to my point with that is, Rudy, you're talking a lot about what is in the second part of the Regional Achievement Complex. That's pretty much the essence of that.
Right.
And I think, Michael, we're doing some work on the rubric and the organization on the rubric. I think we should measure, besides the measurements we have here, I'm looking at number 4 here too, Rudy, that you have a satisfaction indicator on here in professional support. A couple of years ago, in one of the districts I worked in, we did the Harris Interactive Survey, and it was basically a satisfaction survey, and it was all quantifiable data. If we were to embed this type of discussion into that second part of the Achievement Compacts, have clearly defined rubrics, and even have like an interactive survey connected to that, that would give us a whole other element of data than what we've been focusing on previously. And I think then you've got, like the governor said, you've got CCOs coming in that want to align an indicator with that. You have other entities that you don't even realize right now that would be part of that rubric discussion.
Yes, Heather?
If you're looking at different people being involved, the number of educators who are engaged in the compact committee work that's being done, I think that we've got more members than ever working on professional issues in this area. I'm not sure necessarily that we've got to the parent outreach that we want that component, because the compacts are supposed to be part of the budgeting process, and we're just now getting into that phase. And I'm hopeful that those conversations will be going out and that parents will be involved and understand if and what the local priorities are, and what's embedded in that compact for strategies and tactics that those educators and administrators who are jointly working on that, believe will help them get there. And I think that's getting to what Rudy talked about, that commitment, that we're all in it and we all need to be a part of it.
Well, first of all, Governor, I got to say welcome. Because I left the house this morning, my wife says, be sure to tell the Governor that this is a great facility here. This is a good example of a church and a city coming together to build this facility. And in particular, she wanted you to know about the free clinic downstairs. They're doing 500 a week here. Free clinic and also dental work too. And it's saving the Salem Hospital a bunch of money. So anyway, and I think I bought that chair during the fundraising that you're sitting on. Maybe more than just one.
Good job.
This leadership thing, I like to frame it in coaching. Watching this March Madness, I didn't see one coach on any of the winning or losing teams score a basket. And when we take off on what Rudy said about more leadership with people in the communities, I think that's what's going to happen, because the power of the ownership in taking ownership in the communities is going to be by your coaching, your leadership, and I think that's how I see us. If we talked about it a little bit before, but if we can get the communities excited about with this scorecard here. If we get the communities, with the people who have not been engaged before but can get engaged, the people who we know who are in the communities, I think we really have significant possibilities here. And I think I see that part of our job.
Cool. Yes.
Yeah, I'll just follow up, because it's also what we talked about the first part of the morning too, was the buy-in and engagement of the public and education community. And I see that ultimately really as the arbiter of the success of this board. There's been a lot of ideas, innovations, reforms in education, some bad, some good, but the ones that have failed because of lack of buy-in. I think in this state, Sim and CAMS, there's proponents, opponents of it, but even the proponents would admit it didn't really get that buy-in that it really needed. And I think it's really good, the discussion we're having, talking about engagement of the public education community, because that's going to be critical to the success of what we're doing with the 0 through 20 system. There is a lot of skepticism of anything top-down. I think maybe that came out. I was joking about the niceness comments that Rudy made, but I think some of that is kind of lack of building that necessary coalition and foundation among the communities out there throughout Oregon. So I would say that's something we're going to have to do. Otherwise, honestly, we have lots of metrics, lots of goals, and I get the sense out there that some of it's just going to be give the OEIB the numbers they want and they'll go away, and that's going to be a real shame if that's what it turns out to be. But I think that's the danger we're in if we don't create that necessary engagement, to speak frankly. And just to add one more thing, I think we need more connection with the boards out there, State Board of Education, State Board of Higher Education, and looks like with the Higher Education Coordinating Commission. And as Dick mentioned, the ELC, the Early Learning Council for that matter, and some of the other commissions that we're involved with, we have liaisons around the table from. And I don't know if it's really something we can, take, if it's necessary to discuss on the agenda at the meeting, but the Chief Education Officer is now sending out briefs, regular briefs to us as a board. And it wouldn't hurt to get some updates, either directly from those boards and commissions and their liaisons or through that brief, but to know what's going on, because I think some of it's parallel and some of it really is not coordinated, and that's not really the 0 through 20 system we're talking about.
Yeah,
For me,
those are,
one of the things I'm really looking for, and I don't know how you get at this, but I want to see teachers and students arm in arm together and get excited about the whole educational process. And to me, if that happens, we will know we've had a winner. And that's a little harder to get at. But I think about the high school students who are sort of, can say, they may like going to school, they may not like going to school. But I like what Johanna was saying about teachers being engaged, and if we can make that connection with students so that they are excited about what they are doing in the classroom, this will have been a success.
Nancy?
So I think ultimately we're responsible to make sure Senate Bill 909 gets implemented. I think what we've really focused on this morning is this important of, it's going to happen through the communities for them to really own. And just one thing that came out of this morning's conversation, which I think is great, would be that each of us come up with 20, 25 leaders in our community that could have a meeting with Rudy or, the appropriate people to really have, so that Rudy is engaging with leaders in our community around this, so that people are getting motivated, really understand it, but people are getting to know him and the work happening for the OEIB. So we were looking for some, important roles for us that are at the policy level. So I think it's part of our responsibility to make sure the community is engaged.
Yeah, I see two challenges. One is we've got to have, and especially kind of some of your colleagues in Bend on this, we have to have a process where the policy is actually driven by educators. We need a way to ensure that what we're doing makes sense at the point of delivery. It's like being a legislator in an ER doc. You can make budgetary decisions, which are budgetary decisions, and then you can go home and sort of see what happens when people lose coverage, for example, and come into the ER. So that's one part of it. The other part of it to make that successful is this community buy-in, and I really believe that there's magic in creating a vessel where people are doing things together on behalf of a shared place. There's some real power in it. There's a little book by a guy named Dan Kemmis, who used to be mayor of Missoula, Montana, called Community and the Politics of Place. It's just a little quick read, but it really is about what happens when you get people together and they feel that it's their community. And the meeting that we had over in Eastern Oregon, and you can duplicate this all over the place. You can duplicate it in watershed councils. You can duplicate it in all sorts of different ways. It's just the head of the CCO was there because they suddenly realized what the P through 20 was about, and that they have every both financial interest and human interest in making sure that kids are healthy when they get to school, because that's less chronic illness coming into their CCO, which is operating on a capitated budget. The public libraries, who, when these kids come in and check out a book to get this, what's the card called?
Ready to learn card.
Ready to learn card. And there's a deposit made in a college savings account for them every time they check out a book. And then it connects them to the school's sort of social messenger service, and they send out developmental texts to them. Count cars with your kid today, and it connects them to the Facebook at the school. And there's just a whole host of business people and folks that I think really want to engage, and they don't know about it. But to me, it's like the old levy elections, which were such a pain. But the community was engaged in those levy elections. They knew what was going on, and we sort of lost that. And there's an opportunity here to really bring that back.
So I've got a list of things that were just identified by members that I will again incorporate as a part of the OEIB scorecard. Governor, just by way of identifying a little bit of the conversation we had, we also talked about one way of being able to enable us to both track and use these results is not just in relation to the OEIB's sort of report card on itself, but the one that would be about my performance here as well, and that would be something that you and or the vice chair and or a subcommittee thereof, or however you'd want to do that, would be certainly privy to deciding upon. And and creating at your leisure, at your will. But one of the secondary sort of parts to this conversation that I thought, again, we'd spend a little bit of time on was even if we have a scorecard and we make an effort to frame it around both hard data and soft data measures, at some point the conversation moves outside of us and into a legislative process, which for me is my first time here going through that. And one of the things that will happen in the near term probably is going to be the question of, so we gave you X number of dollars to run the education system over the course of this year. What happened? What happened to the benchmarks? What happened to the commitments? What happened to the things that you said in the last session? And I have been reminded of that by some of the legislators with whom I've met, who essentially have said, listen, we kind of remember a day when we'd have conversations and it kind of was water off a duck's back, and it didn't result in anything, and so now you're asking us to now do another investment, and what's different about why we should believe that this will result in anything different from the outcome of the past. They raise a very legitimate issue about continuity, about clarity of outcomes and the willingness to share those outcomes outside of our own world here. And to that end, on page 5, Seth, if you could tee up page 5 for me. I took a stab at this question of continuity when we were passing the strategic plan 2 months ago. And my effort here, feeble as it may be, was to simply draw our attention to the fact that as a board, we're not obligated to a one-time commitment to the field. We're obligated to a multi-year commitment to the field with a continuous flow both of investment dollars, but also good data and feedback as to what happened as a result of those investment dollars. And it seemed to me that as I'm now going through the legislative process and hearing, what they're interested in going forward to 15-17 and 17-19 and so on and so forth, that it might be useful for us to start thinking a little bit about now how do we want to thread this needle going into yet another biennium, albeit we're not out of this one, but at least thinking strategically about how do we want to start this work that we're in right now, connecting to the work that we want to be doing on the next wave. And so what this page 5 represented was, if we said 7 years from now, we want to be doing the following work, the work that at least, and I quickly went over it again this morning, the work that I spec'd out was we'd want to be in the bucket of work that actually demonstrates that we have built the capacity of this education system to respond to the needed connections between labor and the economy. That would be an area that we really desperately need to make sure we've got traction in. This is specific to the goal that we had, that when people graduate from one of our institutions here, that they find work within 12 months. Right? And that, so what does that look like from a board standpoint, for us to be doing more of or less of? A second one was, if we were going to be 7 years down the road and we essentially needed to define the work that we'd be doing for continuity purposes, there's career training and building this college-going culture. I don't think 1 year investment in the college-going culture is going to be enough. I think this is going to be a good 5 to 7 years of an investment strategy. It probably will morph and change over time, but that this bucket is not going to go away in the next 7 years. A third one is communities for healthy children. Governor, you had mentioned one day in another conversation about the need to start bringing the health community more and more and more directly in connection to the education community. And so I picked that up and placed it in this category of the next 7 year bucket.
I like that emotionally centered term.
Pardon me?
I like that emotionally centered term.
Yeah, it speaks to my need. which I still have a lot of growth to do. The fourth area was this whole issue of family supportive learning. Now, specifically for me, this was really much more, or at least as much, about the issue of how do we want to use technology to start reaching many, many more people and providing kind of a, if you will, a mass level of communication and support. New people coming into the state, demographic shifts, changing the face and color and level of poverty and all kinds of things of our state. How would that now, result in there being new and different ways of being able to reach people as soon as they come into this state? And the last is, we've had a lot of conversation about academic preparation for the purpose of being more literate, having greater numeracy skills, being eligible for placement in a 2 or 4 year institution, graduating. But this really speaks to the issue of academic preparation around this issue of civic literacy. The idea here that you belong to a community, and it's a community that you have, if you will, an obligation to, and it has a community, and it has an obligation to you as well. So there's a sense of, how we should be thinking about civics, I won't even say civics instruction, but how do we think about the notion of civic mindedness in the context not only of communities, but in the context of student learning. So these would be the buckets. My question to the board essentially is, are these accurate? Are they not accurate? Do you think this is kind of where the scope of work will, eventually morph into? Are there things that are not in here that you think should be here, and so on and so forth?
Well, I think they, having not spent a lot of time looking at the chart, I think what speaks to me from this is really the integration or the interrelationship between all of those paths. Obviously, I think the family supportive learning is just a huge one, and that's very related to the communities for healthy children. I mean, a lot of these things they speak to both the front end, which is really where you get the big gains, but also the actual educational process itself. I think it's very good.
Now, this assumes that there are going to be gains on the academic side. This assumes that we will have worked through the kinks of loose, tight, tight, loose. It assumes that we've worked through a whole host of issues around data and data delivery and so on and so forth. It doesn't make light of the things that we've got in our front door right now. It just simply says, when people in the field say, listen, I'm willing to start a pilot, I'm willing to help, advance the ball here, but don't leave me in a lurch 2 years later and withdraw this money. Mm-hmm. Don't give me hope and then withdraw it because there's no more dollars in the budget to be able to continue this massive program that I'm undertaking right now. So what I've tried to do here is to just build the container so that we can continuously have this sort of flowing conversation, not so much about a 2-year investment, but what would a 5 to 7 year investment look like?
So it strikes me there's about 4 things that are necessary for this work. One of them you spoke to. You got to have adequate and stable funding.
Right.
So, I mean, it's got to be adequate, but it also has to be predictable and stable. So you don't. Secondly, you've got to have buy-in by the education community. They have to own this, feel like they own it. The third one is you have to have buy-in by the community, which is, because I don't think you can be successful without that. So the community has to own it. And then the fourth one is you do have to have that pretty robust longitudinal database to be able to actually tell you whether or not you are on track or whether you need to make midterm course adjustments.
And as we talked about this, and I think I go back, I don't remember what meeting it was, but when the governor came in and shared different people's responsibilities to us for education to be successful in Oregon. We talked about students' responsibility, parents, community, and I think that family supportive learning is a component of that, but I think as we talked just a moment ago about the shared commitment to really seeing change in Oregon. Families, yes, need to be a part of that, but if we're not all in it together, it's not going to be successful. And I can tell you, if you're in a school and the principal comes and they say, well, we're going to implement this program and you're going to do it this way, it's not as successful as if there's buy-in and commitment by everyone. And you can get, as a leader, you can get the same thing, I believe. You lead by helping people understand the issues and getting their buy-in and commitment to do that. So that's the piece here, I think, that could be missing for me, is that shared commitment to the work that we do.
By the larger community?
Yeah, by the larger, by each, I think you outlined everyone, parents, students have a commitment. It really pains me when I hear examples of the student who comes in to take the standardized test, doesn't really care. They're not going to college, they could care less.
Right.
And that doesn't help us get there. And how do we help that student care about that? And how do we get parents to care about some of the issues that we're dealing with, and give them the tools that they need to support their child, because we're a very poor state. Poverty is a huge issue for us, and our parents are struggling, 2 and 3 jobs, and they want to help their kids and they're not able to do that sometimes. And how do we help them be able to do that as a community?
Rudy, primarily, who do you see the audience for this document being?
Well, this document was for the board as it was prepared. This document was for the board. What I'm describing is our dialogue with the outside world does not stay contained to this document. People ask the question, are you gonna fund this for 5 years? Because I'm in. If it's more than a year, I've had the experience of people funding things and then it goes away and then I've got to rip it out of my school. Let me give you a classic example is Harriet Tubman Young Ladies Leadership Academy, right? So they've called already and said, listen, this was a largely poor African American and Hispanic school that got shut down. Now they're calling and they're saying, I understand that you are trying to, that there's money that the governor's put aside for dollars to be going to pilot programs that will extend opportunities for young women and for students who are in poor communities, challenged communities, in STEM. And we'd like to open up, we'd like to at least open the debate as to how we can use that pilot money to get this school back on its feet, right? I then talked with the superintendent. The superintendent says, Rudy, I'm more than willing to do it, but you can't make a 1-year commitment to this sort of thing. You got to make a multi-year commitment to this sort of thing, right? So the reality is these conversations span 5 years. And we've got to be talking as an investment board, we've got to be talking about what's the level of commitment in dollars and cents, and I'm not talking about actual dollars, but maybe what's our framing of of an answer to communities that are saying, I'm in, I'm leaning in, I'll go, I'm trying, I will do this, but don't rip this floor out from under me at the end of 6 months or a year.
I agree with you 100%. I didn't get that from reading this document. So maybe instead of focus over the next 7 years, a sustainability plan, investment plan. Because what I'm reading, what I like about it, Rudy, is we have all of our indicators over here in our education jargon. To me, this resonates for communities outside of our jargon. You look at those results, more Oregonians employed today. That's what we are looking to sustain for the next 7 years, is that end result. That's the ultimate 30,000 foot level, like we were talking about, indicator at the bottom. So I guess my feedback would be, when I looked at this, I didn't take away from where you're passionate about, we're going to sustain this effort. We're going to persevere. We're going to reinvest, but it's not going to be done in a year. So maybe the title itself, rather than what our focus is, our sustainability plan, to deliver for Oregon.
I still want to reinforce what you were saying, because I think you speak to the issue of how do you get children, young people committed to the educational system. We can't break promises.
Right.
That's very hard to undo that. And that's what happened over at Area Pelham.
Yeah, no, they're exercised about that. And that's why the hesitancy now to come out of the barn is, you know, we drank the Kool-Aid on the first round, you know, and so now you're asking me to do this again and so forth. So I'm just simply saying, and these are not intended, these categories of work are just intended to say, listen, we got 4 strategic objectives, strategic investments now, initiatives now. Are they going to be the same 4 going forward? Or should we be thinking about other ones, you know, down the pike here? And if so, how do we start getting geared up for that?
I think that would be really appreciated, because we haven't talked about that a lot. We haven't talked about long-term, we stated the term, Governor, you know, adequate and stable funding, but we haven't shown a commitment past the biennium.
Right.
I think this goes a long way for people maybe to be a little more innovative, to take a few more risks, to know that there's at least a philosophy and a vision out there to support that.
Right.
And, you know, I think the 10-year budget frame that we're setting up can facilitate this, because you can sort of,
Makes sense.
Brittany.
So one of the things I was wondering in the categories of work, and it might not be a category of work, it might be something that lies over the top, but it really was around that innovation, risk-taking, continuous improvement. So even as we lay out a sustainability plan and categories of work that we're committing to over the long term, I would want to see some sort of commitment to the innovation and examination of the tools that we're using, technology, all of the things that we've barely scratched the surface of that might impact the focus as we move forward in this really fast-changing world.
So I think about that idea, there's just an and I would add, and that is whenever we talk about innovation and pilots and give individual examples, I see there's always this fear, like, so what if we're not one of the examples? And it's about the scalability and scale up. So if we say we're going to invest and we use language like we're going to start with pilots and we're going to pick some of these key things that we think are really good models, for example, what's going on in Pendleton, and we talk about the long-term investment. Is it a long-term investment to that particular plan?
Right.
And do we have a plan for how that scales up to every community who might want to duplicate that thing?
Very good point.
Well, if I may.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
be
No.
Well, I think it's like a business plan of an initial public offering. It's an IPO. And if you're soliciting people to invest in your idea to sell a widget, you want to have your very best foot forward as you're going along, because eventually you're going to have to go public, which you really want a big ROI on. Except we're already public and we're already going on and on and on. So I think to get what's in it for me thing is missing, or has been missing in the past. I have the advantage of listening to all of you and having the buy-in from the governor, but there's a lot of people like myself who haven't had that vested interest, who are out there meeting payrolls or doing other things, but they're also the champions in their community. So I think we have to be, and Hannah said it also, is be collective in a collaboration in how we're dealing with at 30,000 foot, but still being able to present the face of this IPO plan, this new year and a half OEIB, Oregon Education Investment Board, and the name itself is Investment Board. Are we challenging the people that we want to be invested, that can make a difference, or are they just saying, I'd be here today and you'll be gone tomorrow type of attitude? So I think it's significant to believe that we have to concentrate on getting the people in the communities who will turn around And I love to demand that from the system to have 7 years out, to demand it to fund it correctly, demand it to that, because they see what's in it for them. It'll be a high tide. Maybe I'm talking to the choir, I guess I am, but we have, what's been missing, and I'm new, but what's been missing is the high tide sales point of view that'll lift all boats, and that someone will buy a vehicle from it. Economically speaking, livability speaking, get out of poverty speaking, all that Sylvia's doing, all that stuff, it all ties together, but we lacked, and I guess I'm talking to the wall back to my face, we've got to engage everyone that can do that. So you guys are the professionals. I'm retired, so I've had time to dig into it, but the digging into it, sales has to be on ground level, being at 30,000 foot that you're saying, like Mark and stuff, but still we have to engage the people who can turn that around and demand it, whether you're a D, R, X, Y, Z, because they know it's a benefit for themselves and live better. And I mean, that's, I guess, but we need to market that as an IPO thing. Trust me, if you have a brand, you talk to Sid and the board. When they opened up Lithia and they went public, they had better cupcakes than we had here this morning, and they put their best foot forward in city after city after city because they knew they were going to go public, and they've been very, very successful. And matter of fact, we need to get him on board too. His son's taking over the business. But anyway, that's the challenge I see. If we can do that, then we've got a long ways. We've been successful on doing this long 7-year program and all that for the whole real estate, not just parts of it.
One thought that struck me on the discussion about the pilot, so assuming that we get the appropriation, and the selection of the pilots is going to be really critical on two bases. One, obviously, you want to pick something that you could potentially scale up. And again, I think this helps make the case for the reinvestment strategy. But you also have to have some idea when you create the pilot, what does success look like? That is, what tells you that it worked, and what tells you that this would be scalable. So I think those are going to be really important questions that we need to think through if in fact we have the ability and the capacity to make those investments.
And probably the other piece to that is, what do we need to know up front to be able to say, we will scale it if it's successful. See, it's not just the successful pilot, it's what do you do with that success? That's a hard question to answer.
Yeah. We had a lot of programs come through the Beaverton School District. If it's shining and bright, we're going to do it, we're going to implement it. And we have some Title I schools and then some non-Title I schools. And the Title I schools have access to additional funds to be able to do things. And I think as we do this pilot and as we look forward, we have to be committed to make sure that we provide the support and resources for them to actually do what the pilots were able to do. You can't expect a non-Title I school to implement the developmental reading assessment when they don't have the additional support to be able to do that assessment with each and every child. So as we build it, to really dig in and understand what it took for them to be successful, and then share that out and let other people build what will work for them, but give them the support and resources so they can do that. And that will build the trust. If we don't, if we just say, this worked here, and now we expect you to implement it,
Right.
We'll fall on our faces, and that won't help us.
Dr. Crew?
Well, I think I have enough to basically rebuild this page with an eye toward how to make this sound more like a lens that leads to sustainability and greater demand. I mean, I like that framing because that's really what was in my mind. I do think that the categories here, for the most part, pass muster in terms of these are the buckets and so on. If not, when you see this again, which you will, one of the things that I want to do with this is then to lay this out against the next, sort of 10 years of what essentially, Governor, would be revenue projections. Because then it begins to really take on, a very different density of a plan. And the work that the board then has to answer, which is sort of where this conversation began today, which is, okay, now you see what this work looks like for the next 7 years, and you have a chance to understand some of the thick pockets of work that we're going to be in. I guess there would be two questions. One would be, who's all in from the standpoint of wanting to continue to do this kind of work, and B, are we structured as a board? Do we have the horsepower, the capacity, the infrastructure to be able to do this? And I'm not talking about individuals here. I'm really talking about from an organizational standpoint. We will by that time be, 3 years old or thereabouts, and it's a reasonable question to then start asking the question about our own capacity to get to the high water mark that Dick was just referring to. From a just a structural standpoint, and committee standpoint, and how we're functioning. My own sense is, and I was asked this question this morning by Vice Chair, sort of what do I think we do well and what don't I think we do well? To be perfectly honest with you, in my sense of that question, I declined to answer it this morning, Governor, just so you know I chickened out. But my sense of, now that you're here, I got a little bit more nerve. But my sense of the answer is that I think that we are still a group. We are not a team, and there's a huge difference in my mind. And so the more this group groups this thing through it, I don't think group will get where any of these outcomes need to be. I really don't. The groupness of us causes us to become micromanagers, and that's just not our highest and best use. The groupness of us causes this to be a conversation that oftentimes is absent data and filled with emotion, and therefore we get ourselves taken down lots of different roads. And that what we need is to actually start thinking about ways by which to build a team. I mean, a real synergistic team that has meetings like this, where new ideas and new notions and new research and new ways of looking at a problem and new ways of really kind of being a solution center for the state. That the solutions to these problems are scalable in some cases, are not in other cases. Some people are going to have some great ideas that are going to be working in one section of the state, and you'd never be able to do this in another section. So we have to be able to find filters that allow us to be the best that we can be, understandably then, link that to the best practice that can be put out statewide. And I think that the question about the board's capacity and how we ultimately want to do that gets raised over and over and over again in my mind around 5 years out, 6 years out, 7 years out, when we're really having to do some heavy sledding around some major, major thick issues. And the one that's on our docket right now that always produces this is this question of what's going to happen if somebody doesn't do well, right? That pushes us right up into the fray of, what happens, who does what, when, where, and how. And it's always kind of a problematic moment, but I would hope it doesn't have to be in the future, because there's no intention here to cause anybody to be either left behind or to be left alone. And either one of those conditions, we will have failed. I'm not leaving anybody, as long as I can find them on a GPS, right? Which I got in my car. They cannot be left alone, and their data can't be left alone. And what's happening in their schools and districts and community colleges and universities can't be left alone. And the truth be known, there are some people that are praying beyond all hope that we will just leave them alone, even if we don't go away. They're just praying that that we'll just leave them alone, and that just can't be. So in this tight, loose world that I'm, dancing in, I just think that's where this issue now comes up, most handily, and we're all going to try to facilitate it as best as we can, but the truth is the truth here.
Well, I think the question of what happens if somebody's not doing well is one that really needs to be answered soon and fairly clearly. And I think because it's the other side of the handshake with not going to leave anybody alone, we're also not going to leave anybody behind. And so the intervention needs to be an intervention that's supportive to try to actually get them, figure out what's not working and get us there without a judgmental approach, but just look, here's the data. And so, I think that's a conversation we haven't. You're right, it's sort of hovering around out there. It's making a lot of people pretty nervous. And the sooner we can get that on the table, maybe even just here in a setting, I had to have that conversation. I think you're ready. You've got the answer, right?
No, not the answer. When you're finished.
I'm done.
Oh, sorry.
I always defer to you, Nancy.
Well, I was just thinking we did start a little bit with the model focus and priority schools. And I'm not saying it's a perfect system. I'm not saying it's easy, but I do know some priority schools that are feeling they're getting a lot of help. And, I think we still want to look at, did we do that right? But I do know schools that felt bad in the beginning, but now they have some coaches that are really helping them. They feel hope around knowing where to go.
And so the other part of that sort of model is this idea of exemplars and pilots. And so once I think we get to take some ground on that, I think about some of the ideas we wove into the EL strategic plan that you'll hear about next time. So that idea of building these networks, which it also links to that, and the idea of identifying exemplars, and then how together we mentor one another from community to community. Once we get a chance to start doing that and get a chance to describe the components that change the culture and get that sort of wheel turning, I think will help all of us have that language. It will also gain some trust, I think, that we know how to get that done.
Mark?
Yeah, really just thinking about this document too, and I'm looking at the results. The majority of these results aren't just education.
Right.
So if you think about all the audiences that are going to impact the results component, isn't our job in some ways to be a facilitator, to be a cheerleader, to be a communicator? We've talked over and over today about engaging our communities, over and over. And I'm just looking at this document. To me, that's the one that, we have OEIB's vision, we have a lot of ed jargon in there. This is the one that could resonate and you could take out to any agency, any parent. Just think it out loud.
Yeah.
Okay? That this is the one that makes OEIB bigger than P20 education. It's about changing the lives of Oregonians. That's what these results are. And this is the doc to kind of show that. You originally talked about, this is a chance for the legislators, to say, well, so what? Been down this road before. We're saying we're going to deliver something differently, but it's our role to facilitate, engage, not necessarily have all the answers. It's kind of been a theme of today.
Yeah.
So when we say results, we've talked a lot about everyone's commitment. Is this results, or is this that we really have a shared commitment by all of the stakeholders that this is what we want to see? That to me is when we actually succeed, when we have that shared commitment that we're all working towards these things. I think we'll get there.
And you think of Danielson's model, what is an exceptional teacher? It's when you have a classroom that basically runs itself.
Yeah.
So you've created that synergy that now it's just rising up from the ground level, and you created the vision.
Yeah, I think that, I don't have to slip out of here, but I think that the distinction, I think what you're both saying is, you got to get past, are we going to go here? to, we're going to get there.
Yeah.
You know, and we're definitely seeing that with the CCOs. They, for a while, they really didn't really want to go there. And now, once they realize that they're going to go there, they can, then it just, then the creativity and commitment just begins to bubble up. Yeah.
It won't without, it's got to have both
Yep.
ends.
Yep. Leave you in the hands of Nancy or Gavel, so watch out.
So watch out.
Watch out.
Other comments?
Well, I think we need, excuse me, I think a good example is Oregon Youth Authority. Fairbourse and I have been throughout the state trying to get reentry out of people, young people coming out of the, and we've been controversial audiences, and it hasn't been one place, whether it's Tillamook, whether it's Grants Pass, Medford, Salem, Eastern Oregon, that it hasn't been somebody in the audience say, hey, I can take that on. So I think we just need to be out there in the community of the people who have heard this story here, and I think we'll get a lot of buy-in.
Any other comments? I'm hearing some just reoccurring themes, so I'm feeling we might be at the point where we've gotten the information we need to allow OEIB and the staff to move forward and take this to the next level. So unless someone has something else they want to add, we could just say we're done for the day. Anyone have anything else?
I just thought the day was great. I think this is exactly what I was hoping. When we talked about a retreat, we'd be able to talk. We'd be able to, I mean, I thought it was well facilitated. I thought the docs were great, and this is a good OEIB.
Okay, so this sounds like a debrief, so anyone else want to add? That's great, Mark. Anyone else want to add to the debrief? Are we good? That sums it up. Let's say that sums.
In July or August, have a social event with ELC, a little social
Yeah.
event, that place that we had it before.
Yeah.
That's why you have to do that.
Yeah.
Just don't tell Gail.
Okay, all right, so that sounds
Really
good.
Set it up.
Okay, thanks for the hard work. I think it was great.
Thank you.